You stand on a rooftop terrace in Ugarit, a jeweled city on the coast of what we now call Syria. The year is approximately 1200 BCE. In your hand, a bronze cup filled with wine from Cyprus. Below you, the harbor is alive with activity. Ships from Egypt, Crete, Mycenae, and distant lands line the docks. Merchants shout prices in a dozen languages. The scent of cedar, spices, and salt air fills the evening. Your city is rich, powerful, and connected to a vast network of kingdoms that span the known world. Scribes in the palace record, trade in cuneiform. Artisans craft jewelry, weapons, and art that will be admired for generations. Priests perform rituals in temples dedicated to gods who have protected your people for centuries. Children play in streets paved with stone. Women weave fabrics dyed in brilliant purples extracted from sea snails. Farmers return from fields heavy with grain. This is civilization at its peak, the Bronze Age, a time when humanity seemed to have mastered the world. Egypt stands as an eternal power, its pharaohs commanding resources that seem limitless. The Hittite Empire controls Anatolia with military precision and diplomatic skill. Mycenaean Greece builds palaces and fortresses that appear indestructible. Babylon, Assyria, Cyprus, and countless smaller kingdoms form a web of trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence. Tin from Afghanistan travels thousands of miles to be mixed with copper from Cyprus, creating bronze, the metal that defines this age. Letters written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the era, flow between kings. Treaties are signed, marriages arranged, gifts exchanged, and peace maintained through careful balance. You believe this will last forever. Your children will inherit this world, and their children after them. The gods have blessed this age. Nothing can shake it. Then one morning, you wake to smoke on the horizon. At first it's distant, perhaps a fire in a neighboring village, nothing to worry about. But the smoke doesn't dissipate. It grows thicker, darker. Refugees begin arriving. They speak of ships, hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors, people who speak unknown languages, people who burn everything, who take nothing, who leave only ashes. Within days, the refugees become a flood. Within weeks, your city is surrounded. The attackers don't negotiate. They don't make demands. They simply come like a force of nature, unstoppable, merciless. Your bronze weapons, once symbols of technological superiority, prove useless against their numbers. Your walls, built to withstand sieges, are overwhelmed. Your temples burn, your palace falls. Your family scatters into the chaos. You die clutching that bronze cup, still not understanding what happened or why. Thousands of years later, archaeologists will find your city. They will find evidence of massive fire, sudden destruction, hasty burials, and valuables left behind. And they will find something else. A clay tablet, one of the last messages ever sent from Ugarit. It reads, "The enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my cities and have done evil things to the land. Does my lord not know that all my forces are stationed in Hittite territory and that all my ships are still in Lycia? The country is thus abandoned to itself." This message was never delivered. The sender likely died before it could be sent. Ugarit was destroyed, never to be rebuilt. This scene repeated across the ancient world, from Greece to Egypt, from Anatolia to the Levant. The greatest civilizations of the Bronze Age collapsed within a span of approximately 50 years. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned. Trade networks that had operated for generations ceased to exist. Writing systems were forgotten. Technologies lost. Populations declined dramatically. What archaeologists call the Bronze Age collapse represents one of history's greatest mysteries, and at the center of that mystery stand the Sea Peoples, a name given to them by the Egyptians, a confederation of groups whose identities remain debated, whose origins are uncertain, whose motives are unclear, yet whose impact is undeniable. Tonight we journey back to that catastrophic moment. We will examine the evidence. We will explore the theories. We will attempt to answer questions that have puzzled historians for over a century. Who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? Why did they appear when they did? And did they truly cause the collapse, or were they merely one symptom of a much larger crisis? Let us begin. To understand the collapse, we must first understand what was built, and what was built during the Bronze Age was extraordinary. Around 3000 BCE, humans discovered that mixing copper with tin created a metal far superior to either alone. Bronze was harder than copper, more durable, and better for tools, weapons, and art. This discovery transformed societies. Bronze weapons gave armies decisive advantages. Bronze tools allowed for more efficient agriculture and construction. Bronze jewelry and art became symbols of wealth and power, but bronze required something crucial: trade. Copper deposits existed in many places: Cyprus, the Sinai, Anatolia. But tin was rare. Afghanistan, parts of Central Asia, and possibly Cornwall in Britain were among the few sources. This scarcity created interdependence. No single kingdom could produce bronze without trading with others. And so the Bronze Age became defined by connectivity. Ships crossed the Mediterranean, carrying copper ingots shaped like ox hides. Caravans traveled overland routes carrying tin. Merchants established trading posts in foreign lands. Diplomats negotiated access to resources. This system worked because it had to. Egypt needed tin from distant sources but had gold, grain, and papyrus to offer. The Hittites controlled crucial overland routes and copper deposits but needed Egyptian grain during droughts. Mycenaean Greeks produced olive oil, wine, and fine pottery that were desired across the Mediterranean. Mesopotamian kingdoms offered textiles, knowledge, and finished goods. Cyprus served as a central hub, its copper feeding the entire network. Letters discovered at Amarna in Egypt reveal the diplomatic sophistication of this era. Kings addressed each other as brother. They exchanged gifts of immense value: gold statues, chariots, precious stones. They arranged marriages to cement alliances. They coordinated military campaigns against mutual enemies. They even complained to each other about gift quality, about delayed shipments, about broken promises. One letter from the king of Babylon to the pharaoh of Egypt expresses annoyance that the gold sent as a gift wasn't as much as promised. These weren't distant, isolated kingdoms. They were interconnected states managing a complex international system, and for centuries it worked beautifully. Cities grew larger and more sophisticated. Knossos in Crete built palaces with advanced plumbing. Mycenaean constructed massive fortifications using stones so large that later Greeks believed giants must have built them. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, covered over 400 acres with temples, palaces, and fortifications. Egyptian pharaohs commissioned monuments that still inspire awe today. Population increased. Agricultural techniques improved. Art flourished. But this interconnectedness created vulnerability. Like a row of dominoes standing close together, stability depended on everything remaining in place. If one domino fell, others would follow, and around 1200 BCE, something began pushing dominoes. The system that had sustained the Bronze Age for centuries started to crack. What happened next would reshape the ancient world forever. The Bronze Age didn't collapse overnight. It unraveled, like pulling a thread from woven fabric. Once the process started, it accelerated. Scholars have identified multiple factors that contributed to the collapse, and understanding them requires seeing how they interacted, how one crisis amplified another until the entire system failed. The collapse wasn't caused by a single catastrophic event, but by a perfect storm of interconnected disasters that struck simultaneously across the eastern Mediterranean. Climate change and drought played a devastating role. Evidence from tree rings, pollen analysis, and archaeological excavations reveals a significant climate shift around 1200 BCE. The eastern Mediterranean experienced severe drought that lasted for decades. Rainfall decreased dramatically. Rivers ran lower than anyone had seen in living memory. Springs that had sustained communities for generations dried up completely. For civilizations dependent on agriculture, this was catastrophic. Harvests failed year after year. Grain stores carefully maintained for emergencies depleted faster than they could be replenished. Famine spread from region to region like a plague. Letters from this period record desperate pleas for food aid that become increasingly frantic as the crisis deepens. The king of Ugarit writes to the king of Elashia, which we now know as Cyprus, begging for grain and saying his people are literally starving in the streets. The Hittite king sends multiple urgent letters to Egypt requesting emergency grain shipments, essentially admitting that his empire faces collapse without immediate assistance. Even Egypt, normally a breadbasket due to the Nile's reliability, faced unprecedented pressure. Lower Nile floods meant reduced agricultural output at precisely the moment when neighboring kingdoms needed Egyptian grain most desperately. When everyone needs help simultaneously, no one can provide it. The diplomatic system that had managed crises for generations began to strain under impossible demands. Earthquakes and natural disasters compounded the agricultural crisis. Archaeological evidence shows that many Bronze Age sites were damaged or destroyed by earthquakes around this time. Troy shows clear evidence of seismic damage in its archaeological layers. Mycenae bears the scars of earthquake destruction. Multiple sites across Anatolia and the Levant reveal buildings that collapse suddenly, crushing people and possessions beneath rubble. The eastern Mediterranean sits on active fault lines where the African and Eurasian tectonic plates meet, so earthquakes were not uncommon, but the timing of these particular earthquakes mattered enormously. A city recovering from an earthquake is vulnerable in ways that go beyond physical damage. Its walls may be cracked or collapsed, leaving it defenseless against attack. Its population becomes demoralized, questioning whether the gods have abandoned them. Its resources become strained as labor and materials must be diverted from productive activities to rebuilding. If drought has already weakened a kingdom, reducing its food supplies and tax revenues, an earthquake could push it past the breaking point. Some researchers have suggested that a period of increased seismic activity, possibly what geologists call an earthquake storm, struck the region. Multiple major earthquakes within a short period, perhaps over just a few decades, would have been absolutely devastating to societies already struggling with famine. The economic collapse and trade disruption that followed created a vicious downward spiral. Remember, the Bronze Age economy depended fundamentally on long-distance trade. The entire system was built on the assumption that tin from Afghanistan could reliably reach copper from Cyprus, that Egyptian grain could feed Hittite armies, that Mycenaean pottery could be exchanged for Levantine textiles. When drought struck multiple regions simultaneously, this delicate trade network became impossible to maintain. Ships that once carried luxury goods and profitable trade items now carried desperate requests for grain that might never be repaid. Raiders and pirates, recognizing the vulnerability of these crucial shipping lanes, began targeting merchant vessels with increasing boldness. Piracy increased dramatically as desperate men with weapons and boats realized that robbery might be more profitable than honest trade. Merchants faced impossible choices: risk the increasingly dangerous sea routes or abandon trade entirely. Some routes became completely unusable, forcing traders to find longer, more expensive alternatives or simply give up. The tin supply from Afghanistan, already difficult and expensive to transport across thousands of miles, became unreliable and then ceased almost entirely. Without tin, bronze production declined across the Mediterranean. Without bronze, the production of weapons, tools, and all the implements of civilization slowed dramatically. Armies found themselves unable to equip soldiers with proper weapons and armor. This created a feedback loop that accelerated the collapse. Weaker armies meant less security for trade routes and borders. Less security meant less trade could get through safely. Less trade meant fewer resources, including less tin and copper. Less bronze production meant even weaker armies. Each turn of this cycle made the situation worse. Kingdoms that had relied on bronze weapons for military superiority found themselves vulnerable to attacks they could have easily repulsed just a generation earlier. The technological advantage that had defined the Bronze Age was slipping away, and with it, the power structures built upon that advantage. Social instability and internal rebellion erupted across the Bronze Age world. When people are hungry, when their cities lie in earthquake rubble, when trade has collapsed and the economy no longer functions, when the gods seem to have abandoned them despite all the sacrifices and prayers, they lose faith in their rulers. Evidence from this period suggests that internal rebellions and civil unrest increased dramatically. Workers went on strike. Yes, even in ancient Egypt, there is documented evidence of workers at Deir el-Medina going on strike when their grain rations weren't delivered on time. These weren't just complaints but organized work stoppages that halted royal construction projects. Cities experienced riots and unrest as hungry populations demanded that their leaders do something to solve the crisis. Outlying regions, feeling abandoned by central governments that could no longer provide protection or support, rebelled against central authority. The Hittite Empire shows particularly clear signs of internal fragmentation before its final collapse. Letters from Hittite kings reveal that local governors and regional administrators had stopped obeying orders from the capital. Border regions broke away, either declaring independence or simply ceasing to acknowledge Hittite authority. The empire was rotting from within, hollowed out by economic collapse and social unrest, even before external enemies delivered the final blow. None of these factors alone would necessarily have destroyed Bronze Age civilization. Ancient societies were remarkably resilient and had survived droughts, earthquakes, and economic downturns before. What made the crisis of 1200 BCE different was that all these problems hit simultaneously and reinforced each other. The drought weakened economies and caused famine. The earthquakes destroyed infrastructure and demoralized populations. The economic collapse disrupted the trade networks that might have allowed kingdoms to help each other. The social unrest prevented effective responses to external threats. Each problem made every other problem worse, creating a cascade of failures that even the most powerful kingdoms couldn't withstand. But there was one more factor, perhaps the most dramatic and certainly the most mysterious: the sudden appearance of the Sea Peoples. Were they a cause of the collapse or a symptom of it? Were they invaders who destroyed civilization or refugees fleeing from the same disasters that afflicted everyone else? To answer these questions, we need to look at who they were and what the ancient records actually tell us about them. The term Sea Peoples is modern, invented by scholars in the 19th century to describe various groups mentioned in Egyptian texts from around 1200 BCE. The Egyptians themselves never used a single collective name for these groups. Instead, they listed them separately, giving us names that have puzzled historians ever since: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Danaan, the Weshesh, the Sherdan, the Luka, and others. Each name represents a distinct group, but Egyptian records are frustratingly vague about where these people came from, or what motivated their movements. The most detailed Egyptian account comes from the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, where massive relief sculptures and hieroglyphic inscriptions describe battles against the Sea Peoples around 1177 BCE. The text describes a confederation of foreign peoples who came from the sea and by land, destroying everything in their path. According to Ramesses III's propaganda, and we must remember that these texts are royal propaganda designed to glorify the pharaoh, no land could stand before these invaders. The Hittites, the kingdom of Kodi in Syria, Carchemish, Arzawa in Anatolia, and Alashia in Cyprus all fell to this onslaught. The Sea Peoples set up camps in Amurru, in what is now Syria, and from there launched their assault on Egypt itself. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show dramatic battle scenes. Egyptian soldiers and archers fight against foreign warriors who arrive in distinctive ships with high curved prows and sterns. The enemies wear different styles of armor and headdresses that distinguish the various groups. Some wear horned helmets, others have feathered headdresses. Their weapons include long swords, spears, and round shields. Alongside the warriors are ox carts carrying women, children, and household goods, suggesting that these weren't just raiding parties but entire populations on the move, bringing their families with them. This detail is crucial for understanding who the Sea Peoples might have been. Raiders don't usually bring their wives and children along. Invading armies don't burden themselves with ox carts full of household possessions, but refugees do. People fleeing disaster, seeking new homes, escaping famine or conquest. These are the people who bring their entire families and all their worldly goods. The sea peoples, at least as depicted at Medinet Habu, look less like a coordinated military invasion and more like a massive migration of displaced populations. But who were they really? Scholars have spent over a century trying to match the Egyptian names with known historical peoples. Some identifications seem fairly solid. The Peliset are almost certainly the Philistines, who settled in what the Bible calls Philistia, the coastal region of modern Israel and Gaza, after their defeat by Egypt. Archaeological evidence shows a sudden appearance of a new material culture in this region right after the battles described by Ramesses III. Pottery styles, architectural techniques, and burial customs that don't match earlier Canaanite traditions, but do show similarities to Aegean cultures, particularly Mycenaean Greece and Cyprus. The Shurdan might be connected to Sardinia, the large Mediterranean island, where bronze figurines of warriors wearing horned helmets have been found, matching the Egyptian depictions. The Shekelesh could be related to Sicily. The Luca probably came from Lycia in southwestern Anatolia, a region well documented in Hittite texts. The Dermian might be related to the Danans, a name Homer uses for Greeks in the Iliad. Each of these identifications remains debated, but patterns emerge suggesting that the sea peoples came from various regions around the Mediterranean, the Aegean, Anatolia, possibly Italy and its islands. What's striking is the diversity. These weren't a single unified people but rather a coalition of different groups who somehow came together. Some scholars suggest they were essentially a confederation of refugees and displaced populations from regions already devastated by the Bronze Age collapse. As Mycenaean palaces fell and Anatolian kingdoms crumbled, populations were displaced. Farmers whose fields had been destroyed by drought, warriors whose kings could no longer pay them, merchants whose trade routes had disappeared, entire communities fleeing violence or famine. All of these people needed somewhere to go. Imagine the situation. You're a farmer in Mycenaean Greece around 1220 BCE. The palace that once organized agricultural production and trade has burned. No one knows who burned it, or why. Raiders, rebels, or perhaps just an accident during the chaos. The complex administrative system that redistributed food has collapsed. The scribes who kept records in Linear B script are gone. Trade with other regions has ceased. Drought has made farming barely possible. What do? You can't stay where you are. There's no food, no security, no future. So you gather your family, your few possessions, and you move. Maybe you join with other displaced families. Maybe you head toward the coast, hoping to find ships, hoping to find somewhere better. You become, in Egyptian terminology, one of the sea peoples. Multiply this story by thousands, happening across the Aegean and Anatolia, and you get a massive population movement. These displaced populations didn't have a grand strategy or a unified command structure. They were simply desperate people looking for survival. Some groups might have been more militarized, warrior bands displaced when their kingdoms collapsed, pirates and raiders taking advantage of the chaos. Others were genuine refugees seeking any place that might take them in. They traveled together for protection, forming temporary alliances that dissolved and reformed as circumstances changed. When these groups reached the wealthy kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean, places that had so far been less affected by the collapse, they represented both a threat and a temptation. Some may have tried peaceful settlement, asking permission to live in border regions in exchange for military service. Others, seeing rich cities and weak defenses, chose violence. The Egyptian records naturally emphasize the violent encounters because that's what pharaohs wanted to commemorate, their victories over foreign enemies. But the reality was probably more complex, with some sea peoples groups peacefully settling while others raided and pillaged. The question of whether the sea peoples caused the Bronze Age collapse or were a result of it is probably a false choice. They were both, The initial waves of sea peoples were likely refugees from regions already experiencing collapse due to drought, earthquakes, and economic failure. But as these displaced populations moved through the Mediterranean, they contributed to the collapse of regions they passed through. Cities that might have weathered the drought and economic crisis couldn't also handle waves of desperate migrants and hostile raiders. The sea peoples were simultaneously victims of the collapse and vectors spreading it to new regions, like people fleeing a fire who inadvertently carry sparks to new areas. The archaeological evidence for widespread destruction around 1200 BCE is overwhelming and heartbreaking. Site after site shows the same pattern: sudden burning, hasty abandonment, valuables left behind, and often no reoccupation afterward. This wasn't the normal pattern of ancient warfare where cities might be conquered, looted, and then rebuilt under new management. This was complete destruction followed by abandonment. Entire urban centers simply ceased to exist. In Greece, the Mycenaean palace centers collapsed one by one. Pylos, one of the best preserved Mycenaean palaces, shows clear evidence of destruction by fire. The palace burned so intensely that clay tablets being used for administrative records were accidentally baked hard in the fire, ironically preserving them for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. These tablets record mundane administrative details from the final days: inventories of bronze weapons being distributed, assignments of military patrols, preparations for some kind of emergency. Then nothing. The palace burned and was never rebuilt. The Linear B script used for keeping these records vanished from Greece for over 400 years until the Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet to write their language in a completely different way. Mycenae itself, the legendary city of Agamemnon, suffered multiple destructions. Its massive walls, built from stones so large that later Greeks called them Cyclopean and believed only giants could have moved them, couldn't save it. The palace was destroyed around 1200 BCE. While the site continued to be occupied for a time, it never regained its former glory. Terins, another major Mycenaean center with impressive fortifications, met a similar fate. Across Greece, over 90% of Mycenaean settlements were destroyed or abandoned during this period. The population of Greece appears to have declined by as much as 75%. This wasn't just political change, it was demographic catastrophe. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire simply vanished. Hattusa, the capital city, was systematically destroyed and abandoned around 1190 BCE. Recent excavations suggest the destruction might have been deliberate, possibly by the Hittites themselves in a scorched earth retreat, rather than by foreign invaders. But the result was the same: the heart of the empire was gone. Hittite records, maintained for centuries in cuneiform on clay tablets, abruptly cease. The last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma-Tasand, claims victories in his inscriptions but then disappears from history. We don't know how he died or what happened to the royal family. The empire fragmented into smaller Neo-Hittite kingdoms in Syria that preserved some cultural continuity, but the great power that had rivaled Egypt was finished. Along the Levantine coast, the destruction was systematic and thorough. Ugarit, which we visited at the beginning of our story, was utterly destroyed and never reoccupied. This major port city that had thrived for centuries, that had developed its own alphabet and maintained extensive trade networks, simply ceased to exist. The archaeological layer marking its destruction is dramatic: collapsed buildings, hastily buried bodies, valuables abandoned in place. One tablet found in the ruins contains that desperate message about enemy ships already arriving, a final cry for help that went unanswered. Other coastal cities met similar fates: Gibela, Byblos, Sidon, Ashkelon, Megiddo, Hazor. The list reads like a roll call of Bronze Age civilization's greatest hits, and nearly all show destruction layers from this period. Hazor, one of the largest Canaanite cities, was burned so thoroughly that the destruction layer contains debris over a meter thick in some places. The fire was so intense it melted mud bricks. Whatever force destroyed these cities was not interested in occupation or taxation, only in destruction. Cyprus didn't escape the catastrophe. Major cities like Enkomi and Kishan show destruction and disruption, though the island wasn't completely abandoned. Interestingly, Cyprus seems to have received an influx of population from the Aegean during this period, possibly Mycenaean refugees fleeing the collapse in Greece. These immigrants brought pottery styles and metallurgical techniques that merged with local Cypriot traditions, creating a hybrid culture. Cyprus, positioned centrally in the eastern Mediterranean, became a melting pot of displaced populations trying to rebuild something from the ruins. The scale of destruction raises difficult questions. If the Sea Peoples were primarily refugees, how could they have destroyed so many fortified cities? Major Bronze Age centers had impressive defenses specifically designed to resist sieges. Yet these defenses failed repeatedly. Several factors might explain this apparent contradiction. First, the cities were already weakened by decades of drought, famine, and economic crisis. Garrisons might have been reduced because kingdoms couldn't afford to maintain them. Food stockpiles that would normally sustain a city during a siege might have been depleted by previous famine years. Second, the nature of the attack may have been different from traditional siege warfare. If large populations of displaced people descended on a region, they might not need to conduct formal sieges. They could simply overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers or infiltrate cities that opened their gates to what they thought were peaceful migrants. The distinction between refugees and raiders could blur quickly. A group arriving at a city's gates asking for food and shelter could turn violent if refused, or if the city didn't have enough resources to share. Third, the collapse of international cooperation meant cities faced these threats alone. In the interconnected Bronze Age system, a city under attack could call on allies for help. Treaties obligated mutual defense. But by 1200 BCE that system had broken down. The desperate messages from Ugarit pleading for help went unanswered because everyone else was dealing with their own crises. Cities that might have withstood a siege with reinforcements from allies instead fell because no help came. The pattern of destruction also suggests internal betrayal may have played a role in some cases. Starving populations might have opened gates to invaders who promised food. Rebellious factions might have collaborated with external enemies to overthrow unpopular rulers. Mercenary troops who hadn't been paid might have switched sides or simply looted the cities they were supposed to defend. The social fabric was tearing apart from within even as external pressures mounted. What happened to the populations of these destroyed cities? Some were killed in the violence. Certainly, mass graves from this period have been found at several sites. But wholesale slaughter doesn't seem to have been the norm. There aren't enough burial sites to account for entire urban populations being massacred. Many people must have fled, becoming refugees themselves, joining the streams of displaced persons moving through the region. Some were probably enslaved. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show Egyptian victories resulting in prisoners being taken, some of whom would have been enslaved or forcibly settled in Egypt. Others might have survived by reverting to rural subsistence farming, abandoning urban life for village communities that could better survive without long-distance trade. The end result was a dramatic simplification of society. The complex palace economies with their bureaucracies, specialized craftsmen, and extensive trade networks disappeared. Writing vanished from most regions. Monumental architecture ceased. Populations dispersed into smaller, simpler communities. It wasn't just that kingdoms fell and were replaced by new kingdoms. The entire organizational complexity of Bronze Age civilization collapsed. For Greece, this meant entering what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, a period of about 400 years with minimal archaeological evidence, no written records, and drastically reduced population. The Mediterranean world had to essentially start over, building new civilizations from the ruins of the old. When everything you've ever known collapses around you, when the world that seemed eternal crumbles in a single generation, people don't just lose their homes and livelihoods, they lose their certainty about how the universe works. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't merely a political or economic catastrophe. It was a crisis of meaning that shook the very foundations of ancient religious belief and ultimately contributed to one of the most profound transformations in human spiritual history, the gradual shift from polytheism to monotheism. For centuries, the people of the Bronze Age world had worshipped pantheons of gods who were believed to maintain cosmic order and protect their cities. Every kingdom had its patron deities. The Egyptians worshipped Ra, Osiris, Isis, and hundreds of other gods. The Hittites honored the storm god, Teshub, and the sun goddess, Arina. The Mycenaean Greeks worshipped early versions of Zeus, Poseidon, and Athena. The Canaanites revered El-Be'elah and Asherah. These weren't abstract theological concepts. They were understood as real, powerful beings who intervened directly in human affairs, who could be pleased with offerings and angered by neglect, who protected cities and granted victories in battle. The religious worldview of the Bronze Age was fundamentally transactional. People offered sacrifices, built temples, performed rituals, and in exchange, the gods were expected to provide protection, good harvests, victory in war, and general prosperity. When a city prospered, it proved the gods favored it. When disasters struck, they indicated divine displeasure that could be remedied with more sacrifices, better rituals, or appeasing neglected deities. This system worked as long as the world remained relatively stable. Good years and bad years came and went, but the overall structure of civilization persisted. Kings could always claim that setbacks were temporary, that proper religious observance would restore divine favor. But what happens when proper religious observance doesn't restore favor? What happens when priests perform every ritual correctly, when people offer everything they have to the gods, when kings build magnificent temples, and still the droughts continue, the earthquakes multiply, the enemies keep coming, and the entire world falls apart? This was the theological crisis that confronted Bronze Age peoples around 1200 BCE. The gods had failed, or more precisely, the entire understanding of how gods and humans interacted had been proven inadequate. If the greatest kingdoms with the most magnificent temples and the most elaborate rituals couldn't save themselves, what good was the old religion? Archaeological evidence from this period shows desperate attempts to appease the gods through increasingly elaborate sacrifices. At some sites we find evidence of human sacrifice, which had been rare during the prosperous centuries of the Bronze Age but appears more frequently during the collapse. This wasn't because people had suddenly become more barbaric. It was because they were terrified and willing to try anything that might convince the gods to intervene. When offering animals and precious goods didn't work, some communities apparently resorted to offering human lives, the most valuable sacrifice conceivable. It didn't help. The collapse continued. The old gods didn't disappear immediately. Religious traditions have tremendous inertia, and people don't abandon their ancestral beliefs overnight. But confidence in the traditional pantheons was shattered. In the centuries following the collapse, we see significant transformations in religious thought across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. These changes took different forms in different regions, but they shared common themes: a move towards simpler religious structures, an emphasis on universal rather than local deities, and a growing interest in exclusive loyalty to a single god. In Egypt, the most religiously conservative of ancient civilizations, the Bronze Age collapse occurred during the reign of Ramesses III, the pharaoh who claimed victory over the Sea Peoples. After Ramesses III, Egypt entered a long period of decline and instability. The confidence that had characterized Egyptian religion for over 2,000 years, the certainty that Egypt was the center of cosmic order, protected by the most powerful gods, was severely shaken. While Egyptian polytheism continued for over a millennium more, it never quite recovered its former assurance. The later Egyptian texts show increased anxiety about chaos and disorder, a sense that the world was less stable than the ancestors had believed. In the Levant, the collapse created the conditions for the emergence of Israelite monotheism, though the process took many centuries. The small highland communities that formed in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse in Canaan included people who would eventually become the Israelites. These were likely a mixed population, some indigenous Canaanites, some refugees from destroyed coastal cities, some pastoral nomads, possibly some escaped slaves or displaced persons from Egypt. They initially worshipped a variety of gods in the traditional Canaanite manner. El was the high god, Baal, the storm god, Asherah the mother goddess, and Yahweh was probably originally a regional deity associated with storms and war. But something changed during the dark centuries after the collapse. These highland communities began to develop an exclusive devotion to Yahweh that distinguished them from their neighbors. The exact process remains debated by scholars, but the collapse of the Bronze Age civilization created space for this religious innovation. With the old power structures gone, with the great temples destroyed, with the priestly hierarchies scattered, religious authority became more fluid. New ideas could gain traction in ways that would have been impossible when powerful institutions guarded traditional orthodoxy. The prophetic texts that would eventually be included in the Hebrew Bible, though written down much later, preserve memories of religious struggle and reform. They repeatedly condemn worship of multiple gods and insist on exclusive loyalty to Yahweh alone. This wasn't just abstract theology. It was a revolutionary break from the religious assumptions that had governed the ancient Near East for millennia. The traditional view was that different gods controlled different territories and peoples. You worshipped the gods of your land. You might also honor foreign gods when traveling or trading in their territories. The idea that only one god existed, and that all other supposed gods were false, was radical and initially unpopular, even among the Israelites themselves, which is why the prophets had to argue so vehemently for it. Why did monotheism emerge from the ruins of Bronze Age polytheism? Several factors likely contributed. The collapse had demonstrated that local patron gods couldn't protect their cities. The gods associated with the great Bronze Age kingdoms, the Hittite storm god, the gods of Mycenae, the deities of Ugarit, had all failed to prevent catastrophe. If you were developing a new religious understanding in the post-collapse world, you might reasonably conclude that local gods were inadequate. Perhaps what was needed was a deity of universal power who transcended particular cities or kingdoms. Monotheism also offered a way to make sense of catastrophic suffering. If multiple gods existed and competed with each other, disasters could always be attributed to one god overpowering another. But this meant humanity was caught helplessly between competing divine powers. If only one all-powerful God existed, disasters must serve some purpose in a divine plan, even if humans couldn't fully understand it. This was actually more psychologically satisfying than believing in a pantheon of quarreling gods who might destroy your city as collateral damage in their conflicts. Monotheism provided a framework where suffering could be meaningful rather than arbitrary. The emphasis on ethical behavior over ritual correctness that characterizes biblical religion may also connect to the collapse experience. The Bronze Age kingdoms had performed elaborate rituals and built magnificent temples, and it hadn't saved them. Perhaps what mattered to the divine wasn't the size of your temple or the expense of your sacrifices, but rather how you treated other people. The ethical monotheism that eventually developed in Judaism placed unprecedented emphasis on justice, compassion, and right conduct as the true measure of religious faithfulness. This too represented a break from the more transactional religion of the Bronze Age. In Greece, the transformation took a different form. The complex palace religion of Mycenaean times, with its bureaucratic organization of sacrifices and offerings recorded in Linear B tablets, vanished with the palaces. When Greek religion re-emerged in the historical period, it was simpler and less institutionalized. The same gods were worshipped, Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, but without the elaborate palace administration. Greek philosophy, which began to flourish in the 6th century BCE, included thinkers who questioned traditional mythology and moved toward concepts of a single divine principle underlying reality. Xenophanes criticized the anthropomorphic gods of Homer. Plato spoke of the good as the ultimate reality. These weren't monotheists in the biblical sense, but they were moving toward more abstract, universal concepts of the divine. The Zoroastrian tradition in Persia, which emerged sometime in the first millennium BCE, also developed a near-monotheistic system, with Ahura Mazda as the supreme god opposed by Angra Mainyu, the spirit of evil. While technically dualistic rather than monotheistic, Zoroastrianism shared the emphasis on cosmic struggle between good and evil, ethical behavior as religious duty, and eventual divine judgment. Some scholars see connections between Zoroastrian ideas and developments in Jewish thought during the Babylonian exile. It's important not to overstate the direct causation here. The Bronze Age collapse didn't immediately produce monotheism. Centuries elapsed between the collapse around 1200 BCE and the full development of Israelite monotheism, which probably wasn't firmly established until the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. Greek philosophy developed even later. The connections are complex and indirect, but the collapse created the conditions: the destruction of old religious institutions, the discrediting of traditional religious certainties, the scattering of populations and mixing of ideas, the need for new explanations of suffering, that made radical religious innovations possible. The world that emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age was religiously different in fundamental ways. The confident polytheism of the great Bronze Age kingdoms, with their state-sponsored temple complexes and elaborate priesthoods maintaining cosmic order through ritual, gave way to more diverse and dynamic religious traditions. Some maintained traditional polytheism, but with less institutional certainty. Others moved toward monotheistic or philosophical understandings of the divine. The religious marketplace became more competitive, with different traditions arguing for their visions of ultimate reality, rather than simply maintaining inherited practices. This religious transformation had profound consequences for world history. Judaism would give birth to Christianity and Islam, making monotheism the dominant religious form for billions of humans. The ethical emphasis that developed in biblical tradition influenced moral philosophy globally. The Greek philosophical tradition, with its increasingly abstract concepts of the divine, shaped Christian theology through thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas. The religious diversity and intellectual ferment of the post-Bronze Age world created the foundations for the religious and philosophical traditions that still shape human thought today. The gods of the Bronze Age, Bol and Teshub, the Mycenaean divine pantheon recorded in Linear B, the elaborate Egyptian pantheon with its animal-headed deities, still exist in museums and in scholarship, but they no longer have living communities of worshippers. The religious world they represented died with the civilization that sustained it. In a real sense, the Sea Peoples and the catastrophes of the Bronze Age collapse didn't just destroy cities and kingdoms, they shattered an entire way of understanding humanity's relationship with the divine, clearing the ground for new forms of spirituality to emerge. While kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean collapsed before the onslaught of the Sea Peoples and the cascading disasters of the late Bronze Age, one great power managed to survive, though at tremendous cost, and never again reaching its former glory. Egypt's confrontation with the Sea Peoples represents one of the few well-documented military encounters with these mysterious groups, and the Egyptian victory, such as it was, reveals as much about the nature of the crisis as it does about Egyptian military prowess. Egypt's first encounter with groups that would later be called Sea Peoples actually predates the major crisis. During the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah, son of Rameses II, around 1208 BCE, Egypt faced an invasion from the west. Libyan tribes allied with foreign warriors called the Shurdan Shekelesh, Ikwesh, Luka, and Teresh attacked the Nile Delta. Merneptah's inscriptions claim a great victory, with over 6,000 enemies killed and thousands more captured. The pharaoh boasts of taking enormous quantities of weapons and equipment from the defeated invaders, but the very fact that Egypt faced this threat indicated changing conditions. The old system of diplomatic alliances and buffer states that had protected Egypt was breaking down. The more famous confrontation occurred during the reign of Rameses III around 1177 BCE. By this time, the Bronze Age collapse was in full swing. The Hittite Empire had fallen. Mycenaean Greece lay in ruins. Coastal cities in the Levant had been destroyed. Rameses III's inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe a coordinated attack by land and sea involving the Peliset, Cheka, Shekelesh, Dinain, and Weshesh. According to the Egyptian account, these peoples had destroyed everything in their path before reaching Egypt's borders. The inscriptions describe two major battles, a land battle in the Levant and a naval battle in the Nile Delta. The land battle apparently occurred somewhere in southern Canaan or northern Sinai, as the sea peoples advanced toward Egypt. The reliefs show traditional chariot warfare with Egyptian forces defeating foreign infantry, but the composition of the enemy forces is unusual. The presence of ox carts loaded with women, children, and possessions strongly suggests this was a migration rather than a purely military invasion. Entire families were on the move, seeking new lands to settle. The naval battle depicted in the Medinet Habu reliefs is particularly significant because it represents one of the earliest detailed depictions of ancient naval warfare. The scene shows Egyptian ships engaging the distinctive vessels of the sea peoples in what appears to be the Nile Delta or coastal waters. The Egyptian ships have the advantage of fighting in home waters, possibly using shore-based archers to rain arrows down on the foreign vessels. The sea people's ships are shown capsizing, their crews falling into the water where they are killed or captured by Egyptian forces. Rameses III's victory inscription claims total triumph. He boasts that the foreign peoples were completely destroyed, their advances halted at Egypt's borders. The pharaoh presents himself as the defender of civilization, the strong king who protected Egypt when all other kingdoms fell. But the reality was more complex and less triumphant than the propaganda suggests. Egypt did repel the sea peoples from conquering the Nile Delta, which would have been catastrophic. The agricultural heartland of Egypt, the bureaucratic centers, the great temples and cities all were preserved when they might have been destroyed like Ugarit or Hattusa. However, Egypt could not prevent the sea peoples from settling in areas Egypt had traditionally controlled or influenced. The Peliset, after their defeat by Egyptian forces, settled in the southern Levantine coast, the region that would become known as Philistia. Egyptian authorities apparently allowed or couldn't prevent this settlement. The archaeological evidence shows a new material culture appearing suddenly in cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza, pottery that resembles Mycenaean styles, new architectural forms, different burial practices. These were the Philistines, who would feature prominently in biblical narratives as rivals to the Israelites. Similarly, the Cheka settled near the Philistines, and other sea peoples groups found homes in various parts of the Levantine coast. Egypt's traditional sphere of influence in Canaan was effectively lost. While Egyptian garrisons remained for a time in some locations, Egypt no longer exercised real control over the region. The strategic depth that had protected Egypt during earlier crises, the buffer zones of client states and allied kingdoms, was gone. Egypt now faced potential threats much closer to its borders. The military campaigns against the sea peoples also came at enormous economic cost. Egypt had to mobilize massive resources to defend against the invasions. Ramesses III's reign shows evidence of increasing economic strain. Royal building projects, which had been a hallmark of powerful pharaohs throughout Egyptian history, became less ambitious. The quality of construction declined. Resources that might have gone to monumental architecture or temple construction instead funded military campaigns and defensive preparations. Labor troubles emerged during Ramesses III's reign in ways unprecedented in Egyptian history. The workers at Deir el-Medina, the village of craftsmen who built and decorated royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, staged what may be the first recorded labor strike in history. They hadn't received their rations of grain and stopped work, sitting down near the mortuary temples and refusing to continue until they were paid. This incident reveals deeper economic dysfunction. The administrative system that had reliably distributed rations for centuries was breaking down. Either the grain wasn't available, or the bureaucratic system couldn't deliver it effectively, or corruption had grown so bad that supplies were being stolen before reaching the workers. More ominously, Ramesses III faced internal threats as well as external ones. A conspiracy within his own court, involving one of his secondary wives and various officials, attempted to assassinate him and place a different prince on the throne. The harem conspiracy, documented in papyrus records from the subsequent trial, shows the degree to which even the royal household was affected by the instability of the age. The conspirators were caught and executed, but the very fact that such a plot reached advanced stages indicates weakness at the heart of the Egyptian state. After Ramesses III's death, Egypt entered a period of gradual decline that would continue for centuries. The New Kingdom, which had seen Egypt reach perhaps its greatest power and territorial extent under pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II, was effectively over. Later pharaohs of the 20th dynasty were weak rulers who controlled shrinking territories and commanded diminishing resources. By the end of the 20th dynasty, Egypt had fragmented into competing power centers. The high priests of Amun and Thebes controlled Upper Egypt as essentially an independent kingdom. Northern Egypt had its own rulers. Foreign dynasties would eventually take control: Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, and finally the Macedonian Greeks under the Ptolemies. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but the Egypt that emerged from the crisis was diminished. It never again achieved the dominant position in the Eastern Mediterranean that it had held during the New Kingdom. The confident expansionist Egypt, that had built the temples at Karnak and Luxor, that had fought the Hittites to a standstill at Kadesh, that had received tribute from across the known world, that Egypt was gone. The Egypt that continued was more defensive, more internally focused, increasingly aware of its vulnerability. The confrontation with the Sea Peoples also reveals something important about the nature of the crisis. Egypt, the strongest surviving kingdom, could defeat the Sea Peoples in battle but couldn't prevent them from settling in nearby territories. This suggests the Sea Peoples weren't primarily a military threat in the conventional sense. They weren't an organized army that could be decisively defeated in battle and then sent home. They were populations on the move, displaced peoples seeking new homes, and military force alone couldn't solve that problem. You could defeat them in one location, but they would simply settle somewhere else, and there were too many of them to defeat everywhere simultaneously. The Egyptian experience also highlights the importance of Egypt's unique geographic advantages. Egypt's civilization was centered on the Nile River, a narrow fertile strip surrounded by desert. This geography made Egypt easier to defend than the kingdoms of the Levant or Anatolia with their multiple land borders and coastal vulnerabilities. The desert served as a natural barrier that limited the directions from which large populations could approach. The Nile Delta could be fortified and defended with naval forces controlling the waterways. Egypt's agricultural base, dependent on the predictable Nile floods rather than rainfall, made it less vulnerable to the drought affecting other regions. These advantages allowed Egypt to weather the storm that destroyed its neighbors, but even Egypt couldn't escape all consequences. The international system that had enriched Egypt through trade collapsed. The tin supply became unreliable, affecting bronze production even in Egypt. The destruction of trading partners meant markets for Egyptian goods vanished. The constant military mobilization drained resources and disrupted normal economic activity. Egypt survived but was irrevocably changed, entering a long twilight period of gradual decline rather than the sudden catastrophic collapse that befell other Bronze Age kingdoms. Among all the factors contributing to the Bronze Age collapse, few have captured popular imagination quite like the volcanic eruption of Thera, the island we now call Santorini. This massive volcanic event, one of the largest in human history, occurred sometime around 1600 BCE, well before the main period of collapse around 1200 BCE. Yet its impact on Bronze Age civilization may have created conditions that contributed to later instability, and it serves as a dramatic example of how natural disasters could destabilize the interconnected Bronze Age world. The Thera eruption was cataclysmic by any measure. Volcanic explosivity index estimates place it at 6 or 7 out of 8, comparable to the famous Krakatoa eruption of 1883, but significantly larger. The eruption ejected approximately 60 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and pumice into the atmosphere. The volcanic island essentially destroyed itself, collapsing into a massive caldera that created the distinctive crescent shape of modern Santorini. The archaeological site of Akrotiri on Santorini preserves a Bronze Age city buried under volcanic ash, frozen in time like a Mediterranean Pompeii. The immediate effects would have been devastating for any nearby populations. Pyroclastic flows, superheated currents of gas and volcanic matter that can move at hundreds of miles per hour, would have incinerated anything in their path on the island itself. The eruption column, reaching tens of kilometers into the stratosphere, would have been visible across the eastern Mediterranean. Massive quantities of volcanic ash fell across the region, with deposits found in archaeological layers from Crete to Turkey to Egypt. The ash would have contaminated water supplies, damaged crops, and made breathing difficult for humans and animals across a wide area. Perhaps most dramatically, the eruption generated tsunamis that struck the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean. Geological evidence and computer modeling suggest waves potentially 35 to 150 meters high radiating from Santorini, diminishing as they traveled, but still devastating when they struck coastlines. The northern coast of Crete, only about 70 miles from Santorini, would have been hit particularly hard. Coastal settlements would have been swept away, ships in harbors destroyed, harbors themselves damaged by the force of the water. The tsunamis would have struck coasts across the Aegean, the eastern Mediterranean, and possibly even Egypt. The eruption occurred during the height of Minoan civilization on Crete, a sophisticated Bronze Age culture known for its palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and elsewhere. Its distinctive art and its apparent thalassocracy, naval dominance of the Aegean. The timing of the eruption relative to changes in Minoan civilization has been debated for decades. The traditional view held that the eruption directly caused the collapse of Minoan civilization, but archaeological evidence has complicated this simple narrative. Radiocarbon dating suggests the eruption occurred around 1600 BCE, give or take several decades. The major Minoan palaces on Crete show destruction and rebuilding episodes, but the timeline is complex. Some palaces were destroyed and rebuilt before the eruption. Others survived the eruption but were destroyed later. The final collapse of Minoan palace culture occurred around 1450 BCE, significantly after the Thera eruption. So while the eruption certainly affected Minoan civilization, it didn't immediately destroy it. The Minoans rebuilt and continued for over a century after the eruption. However, the eruption may have weakened Minoan civilization in ways that made it vulnerable to later challenges. The ash fall would have damaged crops, potentially causing food shortages. The tsunamis destroyed coastal infrastructure, including harbors and ships that were crucial for Minoan maritime power. The psychological impact of such a catastrophic event cannot be underestimated. Religious doubts, population movements, social disruption. Even if the immediate damage was survivable, the long-term effects could have been destabilizing. Some scholars suggest the Thera eruption may have contributed to the mysterious transition whereby Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland gained control of Crete. Around 1450 BCE, the palace at Knossos begins showing Mycenaean cultural influences, including Linear B script, suggesting Greek-speaking rulers had taken control. If Minoan naval power and economic strength had been weakened by the cumulative effects of the Thera eruption, opportunistic Mycenaean expansion might have succeeded where it previously would have failed. The broader climatic effects of such a massive eruption also deserve consideration. When volcanoes inject enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, it forms aerosols that reflect sunlight, causing global cooling. Tree ring data from around the world shows evidence of climate disruption in the 17th century BCE that could correlate with the Thera eruption. Cooler temperatures mean shorter growing seasons and reduced agricultural productivity. For civilizations already operating near the limits of their agricultural capacity, Even a few years of reduced harvests due to volcanic cooling could trigger food crises. Moving forward to the period around 1200 BCE, we don't have evidence of any single volcanic event comparable to Thera immediately preceding the Bronze Age collapse. However, the period shows multiple indicators of environmental stress. Paleoclimate data from various sources, tree rings, lake sediments, cave formations reveal a pattern of drought across the eastern Mediterranean lasting several decades around 1200 BCE. This wasn't a single bad year or even a series of bad years, but a fundamental shift in climate patterns that dramatically reduced rainfall across the region. The mechanism behind this drought remains debated. Some researchers point to cyclical changes in North Atlantic oscillation patterns that affect Mediterranean rainfall. Others suggest connections to solar activity variations. Whatever the cause, the effects were severe. Agricultural societies in the eastern Mediterranean depended on winter rains to water their crops. When rainfall decreased significantly for years or decades, crop yields plummeted, pasture for livestock diminished. Water sources dried up. The carefully calculated systems of irrigation, storage, and distribution that Bronze Age kingdoms had developed proved inadequate for such extended drought. Compounding the drought were the earthquakes mentioned earlier. The eastern Mediterranean is geologically active, sitting at the boundary where the African plate subducts beneath the Eurasian plate. This produces regular seismic activity, and the archaeological evidence suggests an increase in major earthquakes around 1200 BCE. Some geologists have proposed the concept of earthquake storms, periods when seismic stress releases through multiple large earthquakes over a relatively short time span rather than being distributed evenly over centuries. The combination of drought and earthquakes created a cascade of problems that the interconnected Bronze Age system couldn't handle. Drought reduced agricultural output and tax revenues, weakening kingdoms economically. Earthquakes destroyed infrastructure and killed people, requiring expensive rebuilding efforts at exactly the moment when resources were already strained. Together, these natural disasters stressed the system beyond its capacity to respond effectively. Into this situation of environmental stress and system strain came the population movements we call the Sea Peoples. Were these movements caused by the same environmental disasters? Almost certainly, at least partially. The drought affected different regions with varying severity. Areas particularly hard hit would have become uninhabitable or at least unable to support their existing populations. People had to move or die. Archaeological evidence from Greece suggests significant population decline and migration during this period. The Mycenaean palace system, which depended on intensive agriculture and complex administration, couldn't adapt to prolonged drought conditions. Similarly, regions in Anatolia affected by both drought and the collapse of Hittite authority saw populations displaced. These weren't organized military invasions but desperate migrations of people seeking survival. The movements were probably chaotic and multi-directional. Some groups moved south toward the Levant. Others moved west toward the Aegean Islands or Greece. Still others attempted to reach Egypt or Cyprus, anywhere that seemed to offer better prospects than their drought-stricken homelands. These migrations created secondary effects that amplified the crisis. As displaced populations moved through regions, they disrupted local societies. Communities receiving refugees faced impossible choices: share already scarce resources with newcomers and risk starvation for everyone, or refuse entry and face potential violence from desperate people. Trade routes became dangerous as displaced populations turned to raiding for survival. Banditry and piracy increased. The security that had enabled Bronze Age trade networks evaporated. The migrations also spread instability like a contagion. A region affected by drought might send refugees to a neighboring region that was coping adequately, but the arrival of thousands of refugees would strain that region's resources, triggering further problems. This second region might then produce its own refugees who moved onward, creating waves of displacement that rippled across the Mediterranean. The domino effect of collapse wasn't just metaphorical. Actual populations were being pushed from place to place, each movement destabilizing new areas. Natural disasters didn't cause the Bronze Age collapse alone, but they created conditions that made collapse possible. They stressed the interconnected system of Bronze Age kingdoms beyond its breaking point. They displaced populations and created refugees who became the Sea Peoples. They undermined confidence in traditional religious and political authorities. They disrupted the trade networks that sustained Bronze Age prosperity. When the earthquakes finally stopped shaking and the rains eventually returned, the world had been transformed. The complex, literate, interconnected civilization of the Bronze Age had largely disappeared, replaced by simpler, more localized societies that would spend centuries rebuilding. The alphabet itself represents one of the collapse's paradoxical gifts to humanity. The complex writing systems of the Bronze Age, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Mesopotamian cuneiform, Linear B, required years of specialized training and were controlled by elite scribes. When the palaces fell and the scribal schools closed, these writing systems mostly vanished, but the need for writing remained, particularly for trade and commerce. The alphabetic system, with its small number of symbols representing individual sounds rather than syllables or concepts, was simple enough that many people could learn it without extensive schooling. This democratization of literacy had profound long-term consequences, enabling wider participation in written culture and eventually contributing to the development of literature, philosophy, and science accessible beyond narrow elite circles. Egypt survived but never fully recovered its Bronze Age glory. The new kingdom's confident imperialism gave way to defensive postures and eventual foreign domination. Yet Egypt's continuity also meant preservation. The temples, the texts, the artistic traditions, these survived when so much else was lost. Egyptian priests maintained ancient knowledge through the dark centuries. When classical Greek thinkers like Herodotus and later philosophers visited Egypt, they encountered a civilization with continuous traditions stretching back millennia, preserving knowledge and perspectives that had vanished elsewhere. The collapse also reshaped trade patterns permanently. The elaborate palace-organized trade of the Bronze Age gave way to more decentralized merchant networks. Individual traders and merchant families rather than palace bureaucracies organized commerce. This shift toward private enterprise in trade may have contributed to the eventual development of market economies. The Phoenician merchants who spread across the Mediterranean operated independently, establishing trading posts and colonies for commercial rather than imperial purposes. This model of trade-based expansion differed fundamentally from the Bronze Age palace economies. Iron replaced bronze as the dominant metal during the centuries following the collapse, giving rise to the Iron Age. This transition wasn't accidental. Bronze required tin, and the tin trade had been disrupted by the collapse. Iron ore was more widely available, and while iron technology was more difficult initially, necessity drove innovation. Societies that mastered iron working gained military and economic advantages. The spread of iron technology democratized metal tools and weapons to some degree. Iron was more accessible than bronze had been, not requiring the same long-distance trade networks. Looking at the Bronze Age collapse through a modern lens raises uncomfortable questions about our own civilization. The Bronze Age world was interconnected through trade, dependent on complex supply chains for crucial resources, vulnerable to climate change, and organized into competing powers maintaining delicate balances. Does this sound familiar? Our global civilization depends on complex international trade networks for everything from computer chips to food. Climate change threatens agricultural productivity and displaces populations. International tensions and competing powers create geopolitical instability. Natural disasters can disrupt supply chains, as the COVID-19 pandemic dramatically demonstrated. The Bronze Age collapse shows us that even sophisticated civilizations with centuries of stability can unravel relatively quickly when multiple stresses combine. It wasn't one single cause, not just the Sea Peoples, not just drought, not just earthquakes, not just economic problems, but all of these factors interacting and amplifying each other. Modern systems theory calls this cascading failures, where the failure of one component causes failures in connected components, which cause further failures, creating an accelerating collapse. The Bronze Age kingdoms were connected through trade and diplomacy in ways that created prosperity during good times but transmitted problems during crises. However, the collapse also demonstrates human resilience and creativity. Yes, civilization fell. Cities burned. Populations declined. Knowledge was lost. But humanity survived. People rebuilt. New societies emerged, eventually surpassing the Bronze Age in many ways. The cultures that emerged from the collapse, classical Greece, ancient Israel, Phoenicia, made contributions to human civilization that equal or exceed those of the Bronze Age kingdoms they replaced. Collapse isn't the end of the story, but rather a transformation, painful and destructive certainly, but potentially opening space for new forms of social organization and cultural achievement. The mystery of the Sea Peoples specifically continues to fascinate because it embodies the larger mystery of the collapse. We have names without certain identifications. We have descriptions of destruction without complete understanding of causes. We have evidence of massive population movements without knowing exactly where people came from or why they moved when they did. Modern archaeology continues to uncover new evidence, underwater archaeology, finding shipwrecks, DNA analysis of ancient remains revealing population movements, improved dating techniques refining our chronology, climate science reconstructing ancient weather patterns. Recent research has emphasized the complexity and regional variation of the collapse. It wasn't uniform across the Mediterranean. Egypt survived while the Hittites vanished. Some cities were destroyed while nearby settlements continued. Cyprus experienced disruption but also cultural synthesis as new populations arrived. The collapse was messier and more complicated than older narratives of barbarian invasions destroying civilization. It was a system failure with multiple causes, variable effects, and extended time frames. The religious transformations that followed the collapse, the emergence of monotheism, the development of Greek philosophy, new ways of thinking about humanity's relationship with the divine, represent attempts to make meaning from catastrophe. When the old certainties collapse, people search for new frameworks to understand their world. The religious and philosophical traditions that emerged from the ruins of Bronze Age civilization continue to shape billions of lives today. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all trace roots to the post-collapse Levant. Greek philosophy influenced Christian theology and Islamic philosophy and continues to shape Western thought. The Bronze Age collapse created space for these revolutionary ideas to develop. As we conclude this journey through one of history's greatest mysteries, we're left with profound questions. Could the Bronze Age collapse have been prevented if people at the time had understood what was happening and cooperated more effectively? Probably not. The environmental factors were beyond their control, and the complexity of the crisis exceeded their capacity to manage it. Could a similar collapse happen to our modern civilization? The honest answer is yes, though hopefully not in exactly the same way. We have better understanding of climate, more sophisticated technology, more capacity for international cooperation, but also greater complexity and interdependence that creates new vulnerabilities. The Sea Peoples remain mysterious, their origins debated, their identities uncertain, but they serve as a reminder that history isn't always about great leaders and planned events. Sometimes history is shaped by desperate masses of people fleeing disaster, by climate shifts and earthquakes, by the unpredictable interactions of complex systems. The people we call the Sea Peoples were likely refugees and migrants, raiders and warriors, families seeking survival and opportunists exploiting chaos. They were both victims of the collapse and participants in it, neither wholly innocent nor wholly guilty, but fundamentally human in their responses to catastrophic circumstances. The cities they destroyed are ruins now. The kingdoms they fought have vanished. The names recorded in Egyptian hieroglyphs refer to peoples who no longer exist as distinct groups, but the world they helped create, The civilization that rose from the ashes of the Bronze Age shaped everything that came after. We live in that world still, heirs to both the destruction and the renewal, carrying forward both the warnings and the hopes that the Bronze Age collapse offers to every generation that studies it. When you stand today among the ruins of Mycenae or Hattusa, when you see the defensive walls of Bronze Age cities or read the desperate messages found in their destruction layers, you're looking at the physical evidence of one of humanity's great transformations. These weren't just ancient events in a distant past, they were the birth pangs of the world we inherited, the traumatic transition from one age of human civilization to another. And the questions they raise about resilience, about collapse, about how to maintain civilization in the face of interconnected crises, remain urgently relevant as we face our own uncertain future. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that nothing is permanent, that even the mightiest civilizations are vulnerable, but also that humanity has remarkable capacity to rebuild and reimagine itself. The Sea Peoples came from the horizon, mysterious and destructive, and in their wake the ancient world ended. But from those ruins new worlds were born. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson, not that collapse is inevitable, or that civilization is doomed, but that endings and beginnings are intertwined, that destruction and creation are part of the same human story, repeating across the centuries, teaching those willing to learn from history's harsh but invaluable lessons.